Samuel Drauschak. What do you know about the science of planning? I did, by the way. I thought I don't know, I process a lot of things, but Sam is a process scientist. He's there's a whole science to processing. And whether you think that's rigid, whether you think that's loose and allows for variation, is very interesting. I didn't realize when I hear a process, much like discipline, when people hear it, they think some people think it's rigid and it's this way and it's almost militant. But process is very different. And Sam's been studying it for a long time, and everything is a process. I dive deep into it, perhaps a little annoyingly. I just kept on asking questions about it and how deep in his life does he process things, and it's always up for iteration, for efficiency. It's just an incredible topic. Just it opened my eyes. So he created a platform called Trueville, which allows one to map out processes, and it has a whole language. We talk a little bit about that, but it's just a fascinating conversation on process. You might think I heard other podcasts that he was on saying this is a boring topic, and it wasn't to me at all. I think you're going to agree. It's quite exciting. I think it's cool as hell. Thanks for listening. Hi, I'm Joey Pinz. People ask me, how did I lose 130 pounds? The quick answer is always discipline. I started my business, wasn't paying attention to my health, was eating too much, drinking too much sweets. My daughter was born. Next thing I know, I'm pre-diabetic, I have hypertension. I knew something had to change. Discipline. I, like many of you, have faced many challenges in your career, in your family, in your life, in your faith. How did you attack them? How did you approach them? How did you solve them, hopefully? It all had to have some degree of discipline. I'm also asked, how did you found and start a tech business that lasted over 25 years? Discipline. I was committed to it, enjoyed technology, didn't enjoy some aspects of it, but knew it was necessary. Discipline. Our podcast mission, how do we use discipline to better ourselves and society? Join me, please, as I talk to interesting people and discuss how they use discipline in their family and their passion and their careers and how it helped them. Our podcast vision, growth through learning from others. Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. It'll be light and serious. Join us, please. Thank you for consideration. My goodness, Samuel Drauschak. I'm very, very excited to talk to you. Thanks for your time today. So we have to start with this. What's a process scientist? Unfamiliar with this term until, learning about yourself.
Sure. So the easiest way to describe it is process scientists study systems in change. So like we just study change. And I know that's extremely broad. So the way I
Yes.
would describe this is a biologist studies biological processes. A chemist studies chemical processes. A process scientist just studies what's common among processes in general. So like one would say, if I was looking at biological systems, you're watching them change, you're watching them take energy, transform that energy into different things. A process scientist is really trying to understand what is the nature of how systems change and how they want to change. Like what are certain configurations that are better than others? And that kind of spans all processes. So it's a very broad discipline in that way. But the way it applies normally, and let's say in the business setting, which is where I apply most of my consulting time,
Mm, mm.
it's really watching business systems and seeing how we can optimize to reduce cost, how we can, and then the scientist part is just we'd go about it using the scientific method as sort of our backdrop. So like this is not a consulting engagement in the sense that I give you something that's my opinion. I'm giving you process science in the sense that this should be applicable to your business and your business and your business, no matter what the scale or what the size. So that's at a high level. It might not answer your question, but hopefully it gives a little bit of context there.
Yeah. So, I mean, I've always thought that Lean and Six Sigma was this process. Is that part of it?
Yeah, so that is all part of it, right? So there's methods, and Lean and Six Sigma are very popular process improvement methodologies. So they give you methods on how to analyze a process, how to measure it, those kind of things. It would basically be the analog in regular science to saying, electron microscope versus compound microscope.
Hmm.
Those are methods to collect a sample and analyze them and look at them from a perspective. So Lean and Six Sigma are kind of like tools, they're methods. The science is sort of the overarching feeling of like, how do I use those tools? How do I use that data? And how do I actually use that consistently? Like, even if some of it was peer reviewed, would they use the same Six Sigma method in a business and get the same result? The answer to that question is a matter of the process science that's overarching versus like the particular tool or method that you're using.
And under the general science, I mean, under the general science umbrella. I mean, like you say, there's biology, there's chemistry, there's so many different. So is this above that? And I mean, just let's talk about I don't know, caterpillar turning into a butterfly. So I mean, with that's a process that would cover under your this science as well.
Yeah, everything is basically process science is like an overarching umbrella. So this is a great example you bring up, right? The process of a caterpillar morphing into a butterfly. If
Yeah.
you wanted to understand the exact mechanics of that process, a biologist would be better set to tell you. Now, if I wanted to run a study on like what makes a good metamorphosis process, like what would be a good transformation process for any insect, and if I wanted to
Mm.
apply that to, let's say, a human system, or another type of process system? What are the fundamental elements of that particular process that could be generalized and applied to multiple models or systems? That's where like a process scientist might say, well, what is actually changing? How is the caterpillar doing that? What resources is it consuming? Does it look similar to other metamorphosis processes in other areas of biology? And then try to take those learnings and abstract something that we can generalize and we can apply to a much broader scope of activity.
Yeah. So you went to school for biology. You were pre med, and then you're a bartender working there, and then you eventually found out that you didn't like that, but you
Right.
wanted to move in this other area. But I mean, I would think uh, being a bartender is all process. You want to drink, it's got this recipe, it's got this formula. You go ahead with it. Uh, how wide I have processed for this podcast, so I'm just trying to figure out the
Yeah.
scope here. It's why I'm stuttering here, Sam. So it's like,
Yeah.
where does it end? I mean, do you map out process to do laundry?
I don't map them out personally, but I could definitely tell you how to map yours out if there was an opportunity for improvement. Yeah, it's the third slide in my training that I give when I give seminars, and the slide says this: process is everything.
Ah.
And like you're kind of leaning into it. And yes, so the tools that I use, it can be used for your laundry, for your breakfast prep, putting gas in your car, filing your taxes, running a multi-million-dollar business, running a multi-billion-dollar business. It doesn't really matter. It's the same fundamentals. It's kind of like the matrix concept where, everything's just ones and zeros, right? So, if people are looking for specific answers, I'm looking for just how do things change? How do things interrelate? Like
Mm.
process is all things. So if you have the right measurement tools and the right analysis techniques, there's nothing that's spared from my scope of expertise, I suppose you could say.
So where does science and art mix here? It seems to me if there's a process for it, there's no room to kind of to have some flexibility and some improvisation. Does
Yeah.
art play a role into it?
Yeah, absolutely. So art is, and I'm not an art person, so art could
No.
also be a hugely broad definition.
Hmm.
But even the way you describe process right there, process is, in a lot of people's minds, they associate it with rigidity, standardization,
Hmm.
bureaucracy, constraint. In reality, when you design a good process, it's designed for creativity, it's
Huh.
designed for adaptability and designed for flexibility, right? So I think a lot of it is your perception of when I say process and you say process, you're probably imagining something completely different in your mind,
Right.
right? When I say process, I'm talking about just the nature of everything changing and moving and consuming resources all over the place. But like a well-designed process, companies today, for example, they need to evolve quickly. They need to be adaptable.
Hmm.
They need to have let's use a garden for example, right? A garden is always a great example for this.
Very good.
If I have a garden and you might think, well, process in a garden might be I'm tilling rows, I'm putting up things that make sure plants can only grow in one direction. That's a very shallow process design, but that's
Hmm.
one process design. There's also a way to design a garden where you're planting things that are complementary, you're integrating it with the natural setting. That's
Hmm.
also setting a process in motion, but it's a process that's self-governing. You let the weeds and the insects and the birds and the trees and the animals play into that process system, but it doesn't
Hmm.
mean you can't guide the result. You still want to yield produce or you want to yield flowers, but the way you go about doing it Those are two different ways to design a process. They're both processes.
Hmm.
One is inherently more creative and expressive and able to be adaptable. And one is very much like, I'm a human and I put controls in place that it can only happen one way. So like you might be talking about process when you think that. When I'm talking about process, I'm talking about evolutionary processes. How do we make complex systems that can read the environment, that can change? That's sort of the future of process, or at least as I'd articulate it.
Hmm. Is there a process to make process?
Yes, and that's a lot of what my work is about. Exactly. It's and you sort of like, is there a science to make science?
Yeah.
And the answer is absolutely, right? So if I'm a scientist and I'm creating new knowledge, that's the question you're asking. Well, how do I create new knowledge? Do I write a paper? Do I submit it for peer review? Do I get it published? How does something in the scientific community suddenly become new science? There is a process behind that, and it's very similar to this, right? The process to capture process data, to analyze it, to extract new learnings, to create new applications, it's very much the exact same like any other discipline.
Hmm. So I have a tech background and an aviation background, which is kind of an aviation is all checklists. Is that a process?
So the process is the actual activity happening in the real world.
Yeah.
A checklist is a tool that people use to help make a process more consistent.
Interesting.
So, and that's like a great point you bring up, because this is what a lot of people think. They think it's not a process until I write it down
Mm.
or until I make an SOP or I make something against it.
Right.
The process is always the thing that's happening in reality unfolding. So if you're in aviation, I have a very strong checklist where I have to get the plane ready to fly out.
Yes.
The
Yes.
process itself is the cleaning, the engine checking, the maintenance, the actual thing happening in the environment. A checklist is just something that somebody refers to make sure it happens with less variation. But the reality is, even with a checklist, the process is still variable. You're just trying to control that level of variation. So checklists are tools. Trainings are tools. The process is always the thing that's happening in real time. It's reality unfolding.
Mm. Hmm. Hmm. And something that there's never such thing as 100% art, but what would be the process of making a song or a painting?
Sure. So if you sat down and I watched an artist at work,
Yeah.
the process is them synthesizing a mix of their capability, a mix of whatever you consider inspiration, things coming
Yeah.
from their environment, their
Yeah.
previous experience, their emotional state. All of those are raw inputs that go into writing down notes, playing with different variations on themes, playing something. Like that's the process of creating art. And you can facilitate that process as an artist. People do it in different ways. They can have
Hmm.
processes that are chaotic and ad hoc in the moment, and they change every time they sit down to create. Or some artists, they fall into process rhythms. They only maybe write down new song ideas in the morning, or they do it after the shower. Like those are all aspects of the creative process. And you can decide as a particular artist, do I want to enhance that process? Do I like the process just sort of flowing by instinct? Those are all process questions, but everything is a process. You can't say making art or making breakfast or doing the same thing in the factory assembly line every day. They're all processes happening every time. It's just a matter of how you engage with those processes.
So when there's writer's block or the artist is, staring at the blank page, that could be part of the process?
Of course. Yeah, if I was analyzing that, it would be one step, let's say in a process map that says sit here blankly and look at page for several hours. It's part of the process though. I don't know if it's one that the artist wants to repeat, but it could be analyzed. And if I was doing a session with that artist, I could say, what happened before the block? What happens after the block typically? How do you break up the block? What is your process for navigating these situations? How do they usually occur? You know what I mean? It's just sort of that process view or what you think about as process. But there's nothing, you could also say that's the whole thing about process, right? Is a writer's block and spending several hours sitting there, is that actually productive or is it waste?
Hmm.
That's a question, right?
Hmm.
And the artist has to answer that. Sometimes you could say, that's actually wasted my process. I don't need to be doing that. In fact, to improve that process, if I start to feel writer's block, I should walk away and do other things. Some writers might say, I have to sit there in my writer's block. That's actually part of my value adding creative process, and I have to sit through it. It's going to change based on the context. And that's like a very good example for, we don't think of process that way, but that's it. It is what it is. And you're always trying to analyze, well, is this step value adding to my objective or is it non-value adding activity? And that's how you iterate processes to be consistently more value adding and more value producing and try to remove waste from your process.
But iteration, I mean, how much flexibility What's the process of going on a date or justice? I mean, these things are so wide.
Yeah.
How can you possibly put a process to those things?
Yeah, and my short answer is you got to start writing them down. That's the first
Mm,
step in understanding how you can do it, because it doesn't matter what you tell me, justice, going on a date, romance, the whole entirety of a human life, in your mind, in your imagination, it can feel much bigger and conceptually ambiguous
yeah,
than it
yeah,
is,
yeah,
because
yeah.
in real time, it's always going to play out with people in a physical setting in linear time, typically, having actions unfold in reality. And in that regard, there's nothing that you can't look at and say, how is this thing unfolding? How is justice actually manifesting in the world? How is romance actually manifesting in the world? It's nothing more than the combination of people and technology and the nature and context in which we live interacting and doing things in the physical environment. Because if you're not at that level, then you're just sitting still and you're just thinking about something. So you kind of always want to anchor yourself in what's actually happening right now in reality. How is it actually unfolding into something new? How is it
Mm,
changing
mm.
the world around us? That's the study of process.
But Sam, forgive me if I keep pounding on this, but I mean, so so with you love this, I know you do.
Oh yeah,
Uh, but with let's go to romance, emotions. One thing you didn't mention is emotions. So I mean,
yeah,
emotions. You and I are two males. I don't know, around the same age. Our emotions may be similar, maybe not, but there's other parts of our human species that have very different emotions. How do you wrap a process and incorporate the boundless, you know, options and candidates where emotions can go to in romance or going on a date?
yeah. Well, let's say the process of going on a date, I wanted to study the process of dating.
Yeah,
If I wanted to study, let's say, 10 people, and this is where the science comes in, let's set up a study.
right.
So I tell 10 people, you guys set up a date however you want. And then I'm going to watch and observe the date. If I could just be an observer and I could just watch what
Mm-hmm.
was happening somehow
Mm-hmm.
effectively. You talk about the emotional aspects. I'm watching what settings, where are these dates happening? Are we going out
Mm.
to dinner? Are we going out
Body
to the park?
language.
Right.
Yeah.
How are
Yeah.
emotions manifesting? Am I
Yes.
nervous? Am I
Right.
sweating? Am I
Right.
creating more
Right.
smells? Am I
Huh.
sad? Am I
Huh.
awkward? Is my communication stunted? Is my heart rate going up? Is my heart rate going down? Emotions have to be manifested somehow. So, like, if you're using your power of observation and you're using your power of comparing and running experiments and running hypotheses, I could optimize dating, assuming that dating had an outcome of finding a mate. So, if
Hmm.
you say the
That's a
process of
gold mine.
dating is for finding a mate, if
Right.
that was the premise, the scientific premise,
Hmm.
then you could study the process of dating and you would incorporate all those things into a more robust model. Because I could just
Hmm.
study what people did, how much it cost, did they end up getting married? That would be a very shallow study. If, like, to
Hmm.
your point, did they enjoy it?
Hmm.
Was it like, were they happy? Were they sad most of the time? If I bring those aspects in it, it's just other dimensions of observation. But it's not something that you can't capture, because if you can't see it or you can't observe it, then is it part of the process? Is it real? Maybe not. It's just in your mind. So it's really focusing on that sort of everything has to unfold in reality someplace. Otherwise, we're just talking and we're just thinking about stuff.
Hmm. Is there anything that can't have a process assigned to it?
No. In my professional opinion, no. Like, I actually, it's funny, you're walking through some of my training slides, right? One of the
Am I?
first things I tell people is try to name something that's not a process. You can
Yeah.
even do it right now. So, like, you name something in your life that is not a process.
That's not a process.
That's not a process.
I mean, there's something that can't be processed. I mean, uh, I watch somebody play a song. I see them play it on a guitar, and I get, oh wow, that's a good idea. I think I could do that. I go to my guitar and I start playing and singing it. So it's completely random. Um, is there a process for that? And I enjoyed myself doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, you just described the steps. You almost described it as a process. You went and you
That's
saw
interesting.
something happen. You decided to imitate. You went back to your
Replicate.
garage. You picked up your guitar and you played something. You produced a result.
Huh.
Now, if I described it as a tire factory, I would describe it that exact same way. I went into work. I put a bolt on this tire. I produced a result or whatever. It's just you're kind of saying it's not a process because it happened one time. But
Right.
everything is happening one time in this very moment. Everything's different. Nothing's the same.
Hmm. Hmm.
Just because it happens once doesn't mean it's not a process. If it happens a million times, it doesn't mean it's a process or not a process. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I guess the kind of the artful side of myself refuses to believe that there's rigidity, yeah, in things that you do. But you're right, you can sit back and look at everything can have a process.
And I think what you're, like you said, you're resisting the rigidity that it
Yes,
implies, but process doesn't have to be rigid. What I
and you're
would
saying it's
counsel
not
is
rigid.
process is flexible, process is life. So, like, if you think about it that way, there's nothing constraining about looking at your life from a process centric viewpoint.
It's so it's so funny. It's not funny. It's peculiar, Sam. But so discipline is what we talk about a lot on the podcast. I lost a lot of weight. We talk about this, and then
Yeah.
I do hear people say things like discipline is very militaristic, and I have to do these certain things. And I said, well, there's no right answer. Discipline can mean many different. It can mean self discipline. You could still have discipline in playing an instrument, and I guess it's a spectrum. It's not, that's one of my theses about discipline, but I think that's very similar with process. Some people have a particular viewpoint of it and they want to stick with it, but it can be just as flexible and just as organic as anything else.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And, weight loss is a perfect one, right? Where you could say, I think some people like the standardization and the removal of decisions on a day to day basis as a
Mm.
control mechanism to make their process more even and more under control. But you could also just say every day, every time you engage in the eating process and the exercise process, you're just observing and you're trying to iterate and make it a little bit better. Where did you trip up? Where did your willpower fail? Where did you not have a good outcome? Where did you maybe injure yourself in new exercise? And if you look at that as how do I improve that process next time, you're entering a state where your process is constantly iterating toward your objective. You're not relying on not
Hmm.
thinking about it, not having a feedback loop to get the result. For some people, when they talk about making new habits, they rely on that. They rely on the process being stable so they don't have to think about it. But a true evolutionary process is I have an objective, I can be self aware of what I'm doing against that, and I can let my process grow over time. That's sort of the
Hmm.
nature of a more adaptive process.
And the process doesn't always have to be efficient, correct? I mean, so I think that I just recently I had some stuff. My office is upstairs, and I had to bring some stuff downstairs. And I said, well, actually, I need to bring that other stuff downstairs too. Let me wait another minute till So I started optimizing this,
Yeah,
things to do, and so. But that's still a process, but it's not formal, but it ends up turning to a process. But it doesn't have to be the most efficient. It just is a process.
correct. Yeah.
I'm rambling here. Sam.
No, you're not rambling. You're getting it. You're like rewiring your brain around the concept of process. It's fantastic. Yeah, and what you just said is, and just to give you a stat from the industry, so to speak, 95+% of processes that exist in the world are waste. They're not value adding. Like when you go into a business, or if I went and I just shadowed your life, most of what we do is inefficient process. You could say, I have this goal, and about 9 out of 10 steps that you use to reach your goal are usually not contributing to
Huh.
that goal.
Huh.
It's just us going through our habits, our preconceived notions. It's going through, and that's why it's such a fascinating space, because the world is always trying to collapse into chaos just through entropy. And that's just the nature of things.
Right.
Building efficient processes is, in a way, a constant activity. It's that continuous improvement concept
Hmm.
from lean and from a lot of different disciplines, which is everything is lapsing into inefficiency constantly. Most processes are so bloated with it that, like, the opportunity is vast. So, like, from that
So
lens, you could say the vast majority of process is inefficient. It's the only thing that we engage in typically.
So efficiency is a requirement of a process. It's perhaps eventually you may or may not want to get there. So we set up a lot. You mentioned SOPs before. So we set up a lot of standard operating procedures in the business. I have a lot here for the podcast, right?
Yeah,
You got an invite, and you set up a calendar invite. It starts triggering some other things. Invites get sent, meeting link gets sent. So we set up this SOP, and we're constantly looking at it, we're reevaluating it, and we're changing it. So an SOP in your vernacular is a tool of process.
correct. It's a tool that describes a process so that people may quickly learn it, execute against it in a more standard way. You're reducing variation. So, like, as a universal
Reducing
in process
variation.
science, variation is cost.
Mm.
So, like, for your podcast process, for instance, if you didn't have an SOP, you could reinvent the process every time you do it.
Mm.
It would be highly costly to you, and it would be
Right.
highly variable.
And inefficient.
The reason that we create SOPs is so that when you execute the same process or similar process over and over, you do it with less variation.
Mm.
And that creates more standardization. They're one and the same. And in that way, you reduce your cost of process because it's more reliable. You know
Mm.
what's happening. There's less communication. It's less ad hoc.
Mm.
And like in that way, when you're ready to make an SOP, some people say, oh, my SOP is written, now my process is created. But in fact, that's sort of like towards the end of the process management journey. For
Hmm.
you to be able to write an SOP means you know how to do it well enough to get your result. You know how to do it in a standard enough way where you're not worried about it like edge cases. And you're actually at a maturity where you can write it down so that somebody
Mm.
else can absorb it in enough detail to execute against it. Like if you look at the journey of how you evolve processes and manage them, building the SOP is sort of at the end.
Hmm.
There's so much before that going on, people acting chaotically, people acting randomly, people trying to coordinate, figuring out what the process is, what are we doing. You did a lot of process work before you did the SOP. You just didn't
Right.
really think about it that way.
Yeah, and the other great thing about SOP is you can also delegate it, right? Once it's like that, and you can give it to somebody else, and they could do it. I live reasonably close to Disney, and when I think of Disney World, I think of all SOPs. I mean, everything those people do has process written all over it, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just amazing how I've seen. I'll be in line to get ice cream, and the ice cream machine empties, and within a minute the
Yeah.
next one is there, uncovered, ready to go. I mean, everything you think. I mean, there's just I mean, do you have case studies like this when you're learning, and of examples of enterprises that are executing this so efficiently?
Yeah, for sure. They're all over the place and there's great ones, right? And this is a really interesting time because companies are iterating faster. Like as a consumer, it's
Mm.
like you said, your Disney World experience. Think about Domino's Pizza, the
Yeah.
pizza tracker, your Amazon, your fulfillment tracker. This is data. These are processes that now are being highlighted to you. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we didn't have that stuff.
Mm.
That kind of level of data or interactivity against a process didn't exist. The level of work you have to go into for a business to standardize what you're doing, put controls so people can know what's happening behind the scenes at certain times, that's complicated stuff, right? But businesses are iterating in all these use cases, right? Disney, for example, ice cream machine breaks down for 2 hours. They lose X amount of revenue. That
Right.
becomes a business problem that a process engineer at some point in the background saying, how can we make that streamlined? How can we get on top of this? How do we know when the machine's running low? How do we get ready to backfill it? That's all process improvement happening. We as the consumer are constantly benefiting from companies engaging in better and better process management, better data, better processes. And yeah, it's wild. Those case studies are all over the place. The Fortune
Yeah.
1000, you're experiencing it every day of your life. You might just not be tracking because you're like, oh, this is now status quo, right? Par for the course.
Mm.
But this is all the great process work that's being technology enabled and going on all over the place.
Yeah, and I don't work for the Disney Corporation, but I remember hearing
Yeah.
like in the '60s, some crazy statistic how if you walk more than 16 steps, you whatever garbage you have on your hand, you'll throw on the ground. So it's like every 16 steps, there's a garbage can there, and even the flap door, they created that, they invented the flap door of
Yeah.
the garbage can. So I mean, this science has been around for a long time, I guess, is my
Yes.
point. Yeah.
It is. Yeah. Because what Disney has to do to make those decisions, they have to study the process. They have to be able to know what the current state is. They had to be able to watch people and say, there's not enough trash cans and people are throwing trash on the floor. That might be a
Right.
symptom in these certain areas. Somebody is studying and making those decisions, not just based on instinct, but that's process work. It's studying the patterns of people engaging with an existing process and looking for problems and opportunities to re-solution against them. And then their process evolves. And then it's constantly iterating so that it becomes better and better standard services, tighter, more efficient services. And like nowadays, that's the thing. You could go to an amusement park. You could be the person that's like, why is there no trash can here? I've got trash in my hand from this restaurant down here. You might not be thinking that. Somebody's watching that, and then they pull it back as data, and then an engineer is saying we need to reposition these things. A really famous use case, Walt Disney. I'll throw one from my thing in the mix. Walt, he was very famous for. They started building the park. He goes in on the first day, and he gets on his knees and he starts crawling around,
Ah.
and he says, there's nothing for me to see. This is the customer, right? And if I have to walk from here to here on my knees, this is a long time to get from here to here. That's process work. That's putting yourself in the perspective of the process and that's happening and trying to optimize against your value proposition, your customer. Disney has always been a very strong process company, but you'll find everyone in the Fortune 100, Fortune 1000, they've got this muscle in the background. They wouldn't make
Mm.
it otherwise.
I happened to sit in on a Disney, one of their academy. I forget what it's called, but I'll give you one more. So Disneyland there in Los Angeles, Anaheim, they have the Cars area. The movie they had the Cars, and
Yeah.
they have these telephone poles there. And so every Christmas they put up another set of telephone poles and they string lights across so they can have Christmas lights there. So the question was us to the audience, where do you think we store those extra telephone poles? And everybody's like, I don't know where it's going. We store them outside so they get the same amount of light and sunlight as those other poles, so they don't look like they're newer for those 6 weeks we put
Yeah.
them up. I mean, it's unbelievable. So some team said we can't have these poles looking that way. Make sure they stay outside. I mean, it's amazing.
Right.
Where does mind mapping come into this?
So mind mapping, it's a form of process visualization, and this is a pretty broad space. So when you talk about process data, to me, it's any sort of visualization that, or not, it doesn't have to be visualization. It's basically any data that describes a process in motion. So mind mapping is in that field, right? It's like I'm trying to figure out what's going on. And mind mapping is very loose and unstructured. So it might not be a high quality process data set in the sense that you can mind map anything. You can mind map
Hmm.
your feelings in relation to each other. You can mind map steps in a series. But it's just a visualization for some sort of data. And it can be used for process work or it can be used for anything, really, mind mapping.
I mean,
Pretty broad.
it's how I, when I have ideas, I mind map them. That's the way I think. I start with
Yeah.
middle and I start branching out. But from that, you can create processes and start to figure out what needs to be done. I just did that this afternoon today, sitting in the dentist office. I had some
Yeah.
ideas and I started mapping them. And then on the way back, I said, okay, we can automate this and we can, think about how to do that, flesh this out a little bit more. Maybe I'm more process oriented than I think, Sam.
You sound like it, honestly. That's the creative side of process design. When you start mind mapping and you start thinking, mind mapping can be very broad, right? But in my discipline, I'm always going to work clients into tell me how, from your mind map, how the activity is going to unfold where and like what
Mm,
systems or like what
mm.
physical place and who's going to be doing it. When you can get those like sort of three levels of the story and you can connect it in time, then you're really at the level where you're building that process out so it can be executed on. Because like a lot of times people start mind mapping, they'll be like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this. But then you might be missing certain dimensions because they're not
Mm.
bringing it to that physical context. So you're constantly driving people to understand that if this is going to unfold in reality, it has to have certain context to it and it has to be continuous. And that's the art.
Yeah, and I know people like that. They're the 20,000 feet people, right?
Yeah.
This is the way it should, this needs to be, kind of the end results. And then you have to have people perhaps like you and myself who actually kind of roll it out and look at it as where it can be actually
Yeah.
planned out and executed. Uh,
Right.
so, so why create Truval?
So I created Truval actually around this problem, which is people have trouble writing down process data. Like actually, when you're talking about mind mapping, when you talk about, if I said draw a process, if I got 10 people in a room, 10 people who maybe you even respect for being process people, and I said, draw me
Yeah,
the process of making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
yeah,
How different do you think those 10 documents would be?
right. Right.
Pretty
Would they
different.
use pictures? Would they use pseudocode? I'm an old programmer. Yeah, there's so many ways, right?
Yeah, and what detail level and what, I mean, this is the problem that we're trying to solve at Truval, which is if you have no constraints in your language, process is infinite. I could describe it at a 30,000 foot view. I could describe it at a 1 foot view. I could put 1,000 steps to make a sandwich. I could put 5 steps to make a sandwich.
Hmm.
It's difficult and it creates a problem because none of the data is comparable. And also, everyone out there is, you're mind mapping, you're at the dentist mind mapping, your colleague is mind mapping in another program in a different level of detail. We're
Right.
recreating a language for process every time we do that. So our idea at Truval and what we're trying to do is I'm giving you everyone a simple language with simple constructs, make it easy to do, reduce the cost, the learning curve, reduce the cost of actually building the documentation. And our hope is that people will start more conversations with process diagrams, that we will start talking and get better process data, and that can inform better decision making, personally and professionally. But that's why we built Truval, to really get more process data in the conversation and more comparable data in the conversation.
So how's it different from like a decision tree?
Yeah, so it's basically like a decision tree. And I don't know exactly what you mean when you say that, but you're talking about mapping the decisions and paths that a process could take.
Yes.
It's its own language in that it's just everything in between too, right? So let's say to make a decision, I have to consume data and I have to look at it in my screen and then I make a decision. It's just a
Mm.
language that's designed so that it keeps people honest about what I just mentioned actually a few minutes ago, which is what are you doing, where are you doing, and who is doing it. And we don't give you a lot of shapes, we don't give you a lot of colors, so that feasibly, if I gave you the Truval tool and I said, draw me how you're going to make a PB&J sandwich, and I gave it to the 10 people, I'm just reducing variation on what those outputs are. So we talk a lot about
Mm.
that actually in this podcast too, right? It's very costly for me to read 10 different diagrams written in 10 different people's interpretation or 10 different mind maps. If I give them Truval and I have the same language and I have the same detail level that I'm expecting, the way that the system's designed, you will get data that's somewhat more comparable. There will be less variation and less cost in analyzing and working with that data. And to me as a scientist, that's what gets me excited, right? I would love to have everyone mapping the same way, make it easy, and then we can look at that data and we can start sharing our process data with each other. That's not really happening today because process data is really hard to acquire, it's really hard to draw, and it's really hard to read. So, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to move the needle on that conversation.
Yeah, that's really, really, really interesting on that. And how has, boy, you're making my head spin, Sam. How has AI affected process science? Or
It,
has it?
it hasn't yet.
It hasn't.
Yeah, and I don't think it will. So if you think about,
Interesting.
it depends on what you mean by, so again, it's like that definition of process we're talking about. So process science, for instance, I help clients all the time figure out how to automate. Let's say you have a manual process and then you automate it. Automation, you can automate by giving something today that I do to an intern. That's a form of automation. I'm
Hmm.
reducing the cost of doing the process. Ideally, I would love to give it not to another person. I'd love to give it to a software or a technical or the technology.
Hmm.
That reduces my cost to almost pennies to the dollar, depending on the solution. Giving it to AI is just the latest capability to automate to. It's a tool for automation, just like everything else. It's not changing fundamentally the nature of process or the way we analyze processes. In fact, you have to have more complex process science and process work to successfully use artificial intelligence to automate your process because it's such an
Hmm.
advanced tool. But that's how they're related in my mind, or at least my world. So it's not that it's not affecting process, but if you told me how does big data, how does software automation from like 10 years ago or 20 years ago, how is that going to change process? It, like any tool, can make processes work better, but it's not changing the nature of process. It's just a solution.
Hmm. So if we asked one of the, one of the big large language models to give me the process of making peanut butter and jelly sandwich, have you tried this? So what would they
Yes, I
come up
actually
with?
have when I was doing training. Yeah, it has its own perspective, and it's probably like an aggregate of the general human perspective.
Right.
But if I told an AI today to draw that out in a process map,
Yes.
then it gets a little bit wonky. I haven't tried that. A lot of the large language models, they're not there yet.
Yeah.
So I think certainly there's a lot of generative AI disruption that could come into the process space because it could help you diagram things more easily. And we're looking at that from a Truval perspective. But we're like an iteration or two away from, I think, that being viable
Hmm.
from my
So
seat.
you have a mapping language, the TML, the Truval mapping language. So
Right.
is that something you can train an AI with?
Yes, in theory. But the problem we're having is, and to be honest with you, let's say I was interviewing you about your process to make a peanut butter jelly sandwich, because it could be at any detail level. Every time you give me an answer, my next question to you or the way that I'm shaping the data is very iterative. This is a natural thing, right? It's not like a complex thing. Like if you were interviewing somebody on a process, it's not just tell me your process and you just sit there and take notes and they give it to you end to end.
Hmm.
It's a very much like a iterative discovery process, and it's based on so many aspects of the detail you're looking for, the objective that you're trying to document against. There's a lot of aspects there that AI, it's not right there yet. If I told an AI, I just want you to talk to this person, understand how they do peanut butter jelly sandwiches and write it down any old way, maybe you could do it, but you're going to find the result is going to be probably lacking because there's just so much going into that conversation. It's like if I told an AI to ride a bike, it could ride a bike. I could make a robot to ride a bike. Now, if I said ride it down that mountain hill track, it's different, right? There's so much more it has to take in moment to moment. And I think that's where the models are not there yet, because process is such a dynamic thing.
What's your goal? What's your mission with Truval?
Our mission at Truval is to empower people to make better process decisions
Mm.
at the highest level. And that means reducing the cost of getting process data, providing process analysis utilities, providing, people just more knowledge, essentially.
Okay, so let's continue with the peanut butter and jelly analogy, and we made a process in your tool to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and 5 of us agreed to it. What's the next step now?
So the way the tool roadmap is going, if you want to analyze that, it's like you can imagine Truval right now, our main goal is to automate a process consultant, like automate a process scientist like me. So today you could hire me and I could do all this work for you, but there's only so many of me. I would love to create more accessibility. And when you hire somebody like me, I'm going to help you draw out your process data, structure it, we'll analyze it together, and then we'll redesign it to solve your problem. The tool is going to be that life cycle of knowledge we're hoping to put into the tool. So it's your pocket process consultant. So you put your own process in the tool. You click analyze. It analyzes and say, this is where your process has opportunities. This is where there's process
Huh.
risk. This is a different way. Give you a different lens on how to maybe redesign it to meet your goals. And then you eventually come out at the end of that with a process to be process design that's better informed. Like I could tell you to write down the peanut butter and jelly process. And then if I said, now think about how you could improve it, you could do it right now with no training.
Hmm.
I could say, I want you to do it 10 minutes faster than what you just wrote down. You would then go back to what you wrote down because you have something to look at. And you say, well, I could probably take this step out.
Hmm.
Or I could probably make something a little bit less costly here.
Hmm.
I don't have to toast the bread, right? Or maybe I don't have to slather it quite that neatly.
Hmm.
You would be able to do it. Now, if I was going to do it because I have so much expertise in this space, I might make it a little bit more scientific. And that's the tool, right? So instead of you just engaging your common sense, you write it down. The tool helps you kind of understand where is your process sort of weak and how might you address that. And then you're better informed to make a design that your business can use, you can use personally, whatever it is. So that's sort of the vision. And right now we're just at the front, which is making it easier for people to get the process on paper. But then hopefully we'll go all the way through that life cycle here in the next year or so.
I submit that software is never done. Is a process ever done?
Never. A
Can
process
always be improved.
is not even set. Like it's an
Mm.
illusion in your mind. Like you have an SOP for some of your podcast stuff, right?
Yes,
It
yes.
doesn't mean that it's happening the same time every day,
Right.
the same way. You've got guests doing funky things. You've got variation coming into it from every angle, right? A process is never even stable. It's a live thing. I think that's where
It's a
we want to
live
change our
thing.
perception.
Wow. I play golf, Sam, and so I've never hit the same shot more than once.
Right.
Right? Sure, the ball might be in the same location, and but it could have a different lie. There could be different wind. There could be different moisture. The pin could be in a different location. The greens can be in different shape. There's so many variables that you can never really have the same shot more than once. I've played hundreds of times, maybe even thousands, but you can never have the same shot twice. I guess that's what I'm learning with process. You're saying it's never done.
Never. Even in the same, like golf analogy was perfect, right? Even if I'm the factory worker who goes in and puts the same bolt on the same, you know,
Piece. Yeah.
screw or whatever
Yeah.
base every day at the same time, your health is changing constantly. Employees are coming in and out of the factory line.
Right.
Electricity costs different from one day to another. The
Mm,
entire
mm.
context in which a process sits is dynamic. It's constantly shifting, it's constantly changing. The minute you start to think that a process is fixed, the minute it starts to atrophy, essentially. Like every time and every day
Right.
it's different. The only thing we can do is say, is it stable enough where we can reduce variation by putting
Uh,
controls around it? But like that's sort of the nature of what we do.
yeah, there could be some catastrophe with the person that they had to deal with what they didn't before. There could be some, or the opposite, some great thing. And yeah, there's just so many variables. It's fascinating to me. And um, I'm sharing your excitement, Sam. It's very interesting. You're making me rethink everything. I get in the car with with my lady friend, and she has a certain way to get places, but I use the technology, the GPS, and it
The
says a
Google Map,
different way. And that's the way we're going, damn it, because I don't know if there's an accident. It does crowdsourcing. So
right.
she goes, that's ridiculous. That's not going to take us less. And I said, well, let's see what happens. So, I mean, is that a process? Because to get to a certain place doesn't necessarily mean you take the same path. It may mean using a piece of technology to get you there.
Correct. Yeah. The process you're engaging in is the process of getting directional data and applying it to get to your destination. The
So we
steps
talked
that you take or the path that you
amazing.
take is just one cycle of the
Huh.
process. It can
Yeah.
change and it should change. And that's actually the more exciting part because we have more data now in life in general.
Mm,
Process can change faster. 30 years ago, people set processes in stone as a means to control. And as soon as you try to make something controlled, you simplify it.
mm.
Reality is very dynamic, like we're talking about, it's very complex. If you start to say, I don't know how to do this with all the complexity, so I'm just going to forget about the complexity. I might get 80% of the result every time, but at least I'll know what it is and it's the same. But now processes are getting more adaptable because we have more data coming in. We know that we can iterate intelligently every cycle if we want in certain businesses. That's the exciting thing. That's why process work is it's exploding, right? Because I don't need to write an SOP and just let it run for 2 years. That's old
Mm.
school, right? You're just losing money. The real companies are changing their processes daily. The feedback loops are dynamic. Every time a process runs, data comes back and an engineer can say, we can make this tweak and we can tighten this up. That's evolution, right? That's how we're going forward as a society.
When did you get this process bug, Sam? What age? You're a little bit younger than me. I mean, you're going to medical school. Did you have it then?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I think it's very passionate for me. I think it's wired into things I do. I mean, you could say it
Uh,
was early as the first time I played like Sim City,
all right.
on
I know that.
on
Yeah.
like 1995
I
when it's like,
remember
oh,
some
I'm the
stuff.
kind of person that really likes playing with systems and iterating
Right.
and looking how the
Right.
variables. It could be after I decided to forego the medical track and I did my first engineering job where I was out in the field. I was working with chemical systems and things like that. But I think for me, it's just kind of the way my brain's structured. So I really get into it. But I'd say in the arc of my career, in the early 2000s, the digital explosion was happening.
Hmm.
And there was no process knowledge out there to really accommodate. We had Lean, we had Six Sigma, like you talked about.
Yeah.
But where I really caught the bug was I'm just the kind of person that really likes big problems to chew on. And Six Sigma wasn't coming over to financial services. It wasn't coming over well to legal services,
Mm.
medical services. There were people who were outsourcing their businesses to different countries. They were virtualizing their workforce. There were so many process problems that were happening, and there wasn't really a lot of knowledge against it. So I kind of fell in that early, and I've just been chewing on the problems in that space my whole career, and it's been very rewarding. So I just fell in love with it. I've been in love with it for a long time, so I think it's hard to pinpoint.
Oh, wow. So I mentioned, Sam, earlier that I started my business in the 90s. I was working way too hard and working 16 hours days. It's interesting. A lot of processes were probably held back then, wasn't it? But you're young and you're just kind of, off the cuff and ad hoc, and whatever fire is the largest, you're putting it
Yeah,
out. And so not paying attention to my diet and drinking soda and pizza at night. So before you know it, I'm 340 pounds. The doctor says to me, if I don't lose the weight, not going to see your daughter graduate. There's another big variable in someone's life, right? Offspring is going to change everything. So I
yeah,
spent the next 6, 7 months, lost 130 pounds, and kept it off. And people ask me how, like there's some plan, like there's some set SOP. And my one word answer is just discipline. I developed routine, I developed restraint and order and willpower, etc. And I lost the weight. So, given that, how does discipline play a role in your life?
sure. So discipline is consistency in my life.
Ah,
And consistency is and always will be a mechanism to reduce variation. I know we've talked about that a few times, right? So
do
it doesn't mean you have to do the same thing every time, but discipline could be waking up every day and saying, did I do a good job today? Can I make my process better today? That's a form of discipline.
huh.
It's consistency, right? And if you're consistent against any process, then that process will be under review. It will be constantly getting better. Even like you said, you discipline could be I do the same things every day because I'm disciplined, or I prevent
Mm,
myself from doing the same things every day. That's another form of discipline, but it reaches the same result, right? You're
yeah.
improving a process by creating barriers to certain things that you don't want in the process. So they're all kind of circling around that same concept to me. There's not really I don't think a big difference, just sort of like the application of discipline.
The application of discipline. Yeah, you mentioned consistency. It- How often are you iterating your personal processes, Sam?
I'd like to say constantly, just as a matter of course, but it's a hard thing to answer because, like me, like everyone, especially as we get older and we feel like we get into a rhythm of like we do certain things well and we do certain things better than others, you just tend to
Yeah.
repeat and you just tend to get cemented and not interrogate
Mm,
things. I would
mm,
say probably me with my mindset more than the average person. I'm constantly interrogating. Could I do this better? Like, am I
mm.
doing this okay? Like, is there room for improvement? But I mean, I'm not going to pretend I'm some paragon of like changing my life constantly,
Mm.
right? Like we all like stability as humans, I think. So it's sort of a constant practice in a way.
It's the same thing with me. I don't claim to be the king of discipline. Far from it. There's plenty of areas where I lack in it. I never want to project that at all. There are some areas where I'm better at it than not. But yeah, I see your point there. How much is habit part of process?
Yeah, so I think habit, like I said, habit is just the means of the process of habit is the process of restricting yourself from making other decisions in a way.
Process of habit. Wow, I never considered that's a process too.
Yeah. Like if you think about it from that lens, you're just habit means you're not allowing yourself to deviate and make certain decisions based on circumstances. That's really what the meaning of a habit. And I think also habit you could look at as the process of increasing your process mastery through repetition. So if you decide like I want to improve this process in the state that I've described it by just doing it over and over in the exact same way, that's sort of how habits are usually thought
Oh,
about. And in
mm,
that, you're also improving your process because you're slowly and passively getting better at that particular thing by choosing not to deviate from it. In my life, I tended not to align to habit and repetition and consistency as much as I like to. This whole evolutionary concept is more where I'm trying to be, which is that if I'm present and I'm looking for my process to always be the strongest it can be, it has to, by its nature, take in the environment and the context around me to be intelligent. So, in a way, I have less controls in my life, but I'm more open to opportunity constantly. And that means I have to be disciplined more on the principle level than on like the activity level, if that makes sense.
hmm. If I want to start a new habit, I try to couple it with a current one. So, I
Yeah.
brush my teeth every morning. So now I do push-ups after I brush my teeth. All right. Now after I do push-ups, I start to journal or I meditate. So I almost have to fool myself into this new process to create a habit.
Yeah. It's certainly a good way to do it. And that's exploiting a lot of our psychological
Ah,
makeup. Because like you said, that's a great way, and that's a great way to build new habits. And then the only issue is then let's say your toothbrushing process gets disrupted, then all the work
right.
you did to
The
associate
chain
whatever you were doing in the change also gets wiped out with
it
it.
gets
So it's like there's
disrupted.
pros and
Yeah.
cons.
Yeah, because when I travel, I have a different I don't have my electric toothbrush. I have my, other toothbrush and I might be doing it earlier than later. And yeah, there's these other elements that can disrupt things.
Yeah.
Um, Samuel Drauschak, what motivates you?
That's a good question. I think at its base, what motivates me is just to enjoy my life in the moment,
Hmm.
which seems like very free spirited, maybe as like from a process person,
I
but
was
they're
gonna say,
actually
how's that
they're actually one
possible?
and the same.
Huh. How do you enjoy something? How do you enjoy the moment in a process? Very interesting.
Well, and that's where it's funny. Like we kind of talk about it in some ways about a true master of process is a process that's constantly in evolution
Hmm.
and is synced in with everything that's happening in the environment around it. And it's like fully integrated. A very basic process is the one that you set it on rails and it just ignores everything happening.
Huh.
So, like, if I try to put that in my own life, the process of my life unfolding should be one of enjoyment and fulfillment.
Hmm.
And in order to do that, my process has to be open to the present moment and all of the opportunities that presents. So, like in my life, what motivates me is truly to create the perfect process that my life
Huh.
is. And in order to do that, my human process has to be completely open to opportunity to evolve. So that's sort of how those things line up.
What a wonderful sentiment, Sam. That's very cool. So given that motivation, how do you measure success?
And that's harder. And now we're going to start getting into another podcast about my spiritual philosophy, I suppose you could say. But measuring success, based on that is assessing your own happiness levels, I suppose, at all times. Like, can I authentically and honestly say that I feel happy and fulfilled in this moment? That's sort of my always measure of, am I doing the right thing?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, because process is constantly assessing, isn't it?
Yeah. It's like a constant feedback loop a strong process has. And if your feedback loop is saying like, I'm not happy, I'm not being fulfilled as a person right now, what am I doing in my process that needs to change? What's not meeting my objective? And then it's sort of a call to evolve in a way.
Call to evolve. Hmm. Well, I mean, you've certainly widened my perspective on process, and I absolutely love it. And thanks for your time today, man. This was great. Anybody listening, how can they get in touch with you? You want to give the website for Truval, and of course LinkedIn, I believe.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Truval right now is where I'm spending a lot of my energy, and I'd love for people to get in there and play with mapping out processes in their own world. And that's just truvle.com. And otherwise, I'm pretty much the only Sam Drauschak online. So if you want to talk to me, you want to connect, I'm very open to it. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm around. If you just plug my name into Google, you'll just find me. So I'm happy for people to reach out however they'd like.
Make sure to put that in the show notes. And if I'm ever in the greater DC area, maybe we'll get a cup of tea and create a process for it.
Yeah, that'd be fantastic.
So thanks so much for your time, man. I really appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you for listening and or viewing Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. Please share this episode with one or two of your friends who you think may benefit from the episode. Our website, www.joeypins.com. There you'll find lots of resources and you could join our mailing list. Please follow us on all our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Podcast information, the video version of our podcast is on YouTube. Please subscribe. Audio is on all major podcasting platforms. Please follow them. And if you like it, please consider giving 5-star rating. Would really appreciate that. Thank you again for listening or watching Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations.